Hello, my name is Ariella Lubova, and today I'll be presenting my project on ADHD treatment in adolescents. So the first section is, what is ADHD? This section will give a brief overview on ADHD and its symptoms. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Some common symptoms include fidgeting, excessive talking and physical movement, as well as impulsive actions. The symptoms are not limited to this, but these are some common ones. ADHD affects 9.4% of school-age children. This is children from the age of 2 to 17. And the average age of diagnosis is 7. Nearly 10% is a large part of our population, and thus ADHD research and medication is very important. There are a couple of There are a couple of gender differences associated with ADHD. For one, boys tend to get diagnosed earlier. They display more hyperactive symptoms and thus are easier to diagnose. And they also get diagnosed 6 times more than females. There are 2 main types of ADHD: inattentive type ADHD and hyperactive type ADHD. Previously, these were 2 completely separate disorders. Inattentive type ADHD was called ADD, or attention deficit disorder, and hyperactive type ADHD was just called ADHD. However, recently they were both coined together under the umbrella term of ADHD, and thus these 2 types were categorized. Inattentive type ADHD is more commonly found in girls, and it's usually diagnosed later on in life. It's categorized by not being able to pay attention, for example, silently staring out of the window instead of doing homework. Hyperactive type ADHD, on the other hand, is more commonly found in boys and is usually diagnosed really early on. It's characterized by not being able to sit still, for example, fidgeting and running around. It's quite easy to see why hyperactive type would be diagnosed earlier, because it's much more obvious to teachers as well as parents of a child not being able to sit still rather than a child silently staring at the window. It is a giant marker of ADHD when they're not able to sit still. There are a couple of difficulties in diagnosing ADHD. For one, there's a wide variability of symptoms associated with ADHD. Inattentive type versus hyperactive type is just one example. However, even these categories are not cookie cutter. Not everybody falls into just one of these categories, so it's very hard to diagnose ADHD. In addition, the beliefs of those around the person with ADHD can be very harmful and might not encourage the person to seek a diagnosis. The cartoon above is a pretty good example of that. Often people with ADHD will have parents, relatives, friends say things like, "Oh, you're too smart to have ADHD," or "You're just lazy. You just need to get a job and then you'll be fine." And these can be very harmful to a person because not only will they not be encouraged to seek an ADHD diagnosis, it will also hurt their self-esteem and their self-worth. Proper diagnosis of ADHD includes gathering information from parents and teachers, filling out checklists, as well as extensive medical tests to rule out any other diagnosis. This usually includes vision and hearing tests. There are 3 main criteria for diagnosing ADHD. The first one is that the person must display symptoms in 2 settings. Usually these 2 settings are at home and at school, but it's not always in this case. To display symptoms in these 2 settings, it would require information and testimony from teachers and parents to show that the person had shown symptoms in these 2 places. In addition, the symptoms must have began before the age of 12. and they must interfere in functioning or development. In other words, it must interfere in the person's daily lives. There are also associated risks that come with having ADHD. For one, ADHD promotes risky behaviors, and this would include increased drug use, increased probability of getting STDs or unwanted pregnancies, lower test scores in all areas, higher rates of not completing high school, as well as serious car accidents. The next section is called pharmacological treatments. This will give an overview of some different types of treatments, as well as some difficulties in prescribing them. 70% of teens with ADHD take medication. Some common ones include Ritalin and Adderall. Both of these medications are stimulant medications, which is both the most effective and the most common type of pharmacological medication. Stimulant medication has shown to produce higher test scores in both math and reading, as well as benefits in behavior and attention. Here is a little table on some common ADHD medications, both their types as well as some common brand names for them. Most of the ADHD medications, in fact, 4 out of 5 of the ones listed in this table, are stimulant medications. That means that the medication increases activity in different areas of the brain. For example, the first type of medication increases activity in the controlling attention areas of the brain. There's one of these that is not a stimulant medication. That's the selective noradrenaline reuptake inhibitor, or the SNRI. What the SNRI does is that it increases the amount of noradrenaline, which is a chemical that passes information. SNRI medications usually have been shown not to be as effective as stimulant medication, but it is important to show that these are also an option for those with ADHD. For intake methods, there are tablets and capsules, which can be taken somewhere between 1 to 3 times a day. However, in my opinion, the most important thing on this table is the side effects. Some common side effects include headaches, trouble sleeping, loss of appetite, mood swings, aggression, suicidal thoughts, and more. And all of these things impede in an adolescent's daily lives. After all, we already have trouble sleeping. We don't need more. There are a couple of reasons why adolescents who are diagnosed with ADHD often don't continue taking these medications. For one, 40% of children can't tell the difference between medication and placebo. So they don't see a difference of taking it or not taking it. So why should they want to take it? And this results in less than 1/3 of those prescribed medications wanting to continue taking it. This might be because of not remembering to take it, could be due to the stigma associated around medications, which I will talk about later in the video, or it could be due to the side effects that I mentioned previously. Most children with ADHD either completely stop medication or take them on and off, and often this leads to academic, social, and family difficulties, which really impede an adolescent's life. However, there are some good parts seen in taking these medications. For example, it lowered the probability of contracting an STD by 3 times in one study. In a different study, it was shown that it reduced the percentage of substance abuse disorders by 12.5% and injuries by around 3%. It also lowered the cost of hospital bills by around $122 annually. There are quite a few barriers to prescribing medications. For one, non-pediatric providers usually aren't that well informed about ADHD and specifically ADHD medications. This is especially apparent when adults who were never diagnosed, especially in attentive type ADHD, adults that were never diagnosed have a really hard time both being diagnosed as well as being prescribed medications. In addition, some healthcare providers are reluctant to give medication because they fear substance abuse. One study found that 25% of those with ADHD get approached to sell their stimulants, and of those 25%, 11% agreed. There's also the big problem of stigma associated with taking medications. Teenage years are the time where people are the most self-conscious. This is seen in the psychological phenomena of the invisible audience. The invisible audience is where teenagers often feel like they are being watched all the time, even when they actually aren't. And taking medication is a tangible way for adolescents to feel different from those around them. After all, they have a physical thing that separates them from everyone else. A 2010 survey found that 46% of teens with mental health problems experienced stigma from family members, and this usually manifested in gossip, distrust, and avoidance. And of those 46%, 62% received stigma from friends, which usually resulted in loss of friendship or social rejection, and 35% received stigma from teachers, which usually resulted in classroom discrimination. Even though this is such an important topic, there is not much research done on teenage medication stigma, even less than done on adult medication stigma. The one study that I found proposed a model for teenage stigma, and that was stereotype, differentiate, and protect. The first one is stereotype, and that means linking mental illness to negative perceptions. One participant in the study said, Prozac, which is a medication that treats depression and OCD, is for crazy people. I see it on TV. People make jokes about it. This is very harmful because they link the things that they've heard and they see on TV not only to themselves, but to other people who are taking these medications or who have been diagnosed with that mental disorder. And it's very harmful to both to their self-image and their self-worth. The second type is differentiate, which means comparing your old self to your new self. And often this is when the before taking medication and taking medication people are separated in a person's mind. One participant in the study said, in a way, like it just made me feel different, like about myself. Like I feel like I've changed. This is really important because it's not only dangerous to their own self-perception, but it also divides their self-identity in a time where self-identity and self-discovery is really important. The last type is protect. This is usually protection by secrecy, not telling everybody around that they're taking medication or that they've been diagnosed. And this is usually because of the fear of negative peer perceptions. And this is harmful to themselves as well as harmful to their relationships around them. The last section is other treatments, and this includes therapy, diets, and supplements. So first, therapy. Studies have shown that therapy is not very useful on its own, but it is very useful in conjunction with pharmacological treatments. The first type of therapy used to treat ADHD is psychoeducation. The main goal of psychoeducation is to understand what it means to be diagnosed with ADHD and help the person cope with it. And this usually includes some strategies to help deal with ADHD. The second type is behavior therapy, in which participants are given rewards for behaviors to be encouraged. One example of this is when the participant sits at the table for a meal, they would get a little treat to encourage that behavior for later. The third kind of therapy is social skills training, in which the participant role plays situations to help understand what to do in certain scenarios and hopefully change behaviors to mimic what happens in the role play scenarios. The last type of therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This is a talking therapy where the therapist helps manage problems by changing attitudes and behaviors associated with ADHD. People have found there to be a connection between certain types of food, and worsening ADHD symptoms. However, the results from studies have been very mixed. In addition to them being mixed, there aren't very many studies, so it's not a definitive yes, diet works or no, diet doesn't work. It's quite variable to the person. But when it works, high protein diet has been shown to improve concentration and make ADHD medication work longer. And complex carbohydrates, such as vegetables and some fruit, have been shown to help with sleeping. In addition, some studies have shown supplements to be useful for people with ADHD, specifically omega-3 and omega-6. In fact, omega-3 supplements were approved by the FDA for ADHD management. Here are my references. Thank you for listening.